Have you ever wondered what keeps a promise alive across the centuries? It is not ink on parchment, for parchment crumbles and ink fades. It is not inscriptions on stone, for stone too erodes with time. What allows a sacred vow, a divine testament, to withstand the storms of history, the rise and fall of empires, and even the frailty of the very people entrusted to guard it? The answer lies in something both more fragile and more resilient than any material substance: an invisible thread, a thread of destiny, woven by faith and tested by human choice. In the great annals of humanity, one lineage was given the honor and the burden of carrying this thread. The promise began on a starlit night in Ur, when a man named Abraham looked up at the heavens and was promised a line of descendants as numerous as the stars. That promise was fortified in Isaac, the son of a miracle, and passed on to Jacob during a mysterious night of wrestling. Jacob, later called Israel, would have 12 sons, the 12 pillars of a future nation, and among them was Judah. Judah was not the firstborn, the one who held the birthright by default. He was the fourth son, yet destiny had chosen him. His name, Yehuda, means praise, and his fate was prophesied to be the ancestor of kings, the one who would hold the royal scepter until the one for whom all nations waited would come. He was the guardian of the thread of destiny. He was the critical link in the genealogical chain that would lead to the salvation of the world, a monumental responsibility, an indescribable glory. Let us picture Judah at this time, a man in the prime of his youth and ambition, a natural leader with a sharp gaze and a strong frame. He stands on a high rock, the desert wind whipping through his hair and the hem of his robe. Behind him, stretching to the horizon, are the familiar hills of Hebron, the land of his forefathers. There lie the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There graze the flocks of his family. There, every night by the campfire, the stories are told, stories of a covenant, of the faithfulness of an unseen God. He knew his heritage. He felt the weight of the promise on his shoulders. But then Judah turns. Before him, in a completely different direction, is a valley leading to Adullam. From a distance, he can see the caravans of merchants, hear the din of a multicultural marketplace, and feel the pull of a different world. A world of quick riches, of powerful connections, of opportunities unbound by old traditions. In the heart of a young man, ambition and reality often wage a fierce battle with faith. Why wait for a distant promise, he might have wondered, when prosperity is right before my eyes? Why bind myself to brothers whose relationship was once fractured by jealousy and deceit? And then a decision was made, a decision not announced by trumpets, but one that echoed loudly in the spiritual realm. Judah stepped down from the rock. He turned his back on the hills of his ancestors. He chose the path to Adullam. A shadow began to fall upon the road he traveled, a shadow not of the setting sun, but of compromise. He left his brothers. He chose his own path, believing he could build his own small kingdom with his own strength and wisdom. Adullam was a crossroads of cultures, a place where gods were traded like commodities, and the promise of a single, all-powerful God was but a distant echo. This was not a loud rebellion. It was a silent drift, a choice that planted a seed of doubt in the sacred soil of destiny. What happens when the one chosen to protect the promise is the first to place it in jeopardy? The thread of destiny, so divinely strong, can it withstand the strain of a single flawed human choice? The story we are about to uncover is not just an ancient family tragedy. It is the story of a lineage that was nearly erased from the history of salvation, and how it was rescued by an act of unimaginable audacity. An act that will challenge all our perceptions of justice, faith, and grace. Adullam did not carry the soul of the lands where Judah had been raised. The air here was not crisp with the scent of wild herbs and damp earth after a rain, but thick with the aroma of foreign spices, the lingering smoke of incense from small roadside shrines, and the palpable smell of greed that emanated from the bustling markets. This was a city of contracts, a commercial hub where caravans from Egypt and Mesopotamia paused on their long journeys. Here, a man's word was measured in silver, and loyalty could be bought with gold. For Judah, accustomed to the simple nomadic life, Adullam was both a temptation and a test. To survive and to thrive in such a place, Judah knew that the legacy of his ancestors was not enough. He needed tangible alliances. He needed power that was recognized by the people around him. And power, in the ancient world, was often sealed not with a signature, but with a marriage covenant. It was the fastest way to turn a stranger into family, to bind clans and fortunes together. Judah, with the sharp instincts of a leader, quickly understood this. His eyes fell upon a man named Shua, a Canaanite merchant of great repute and wealth. Shua had vast herds, full storehouses, and more importantly, a daughter of marriageable age. The negotiations took place on luxurious Persian rugs, inside a tent larger than any his father had ever owned. Wine was poured from ornate ceramic jugs. Promises of business partnership and mutual support were exchanged. Shua's daughter, a young woman of foreign beauty, with coal-lined eyes and glittering jewelry, watched the proceedings discreetly from behind a thin veil. She was part of the deal, a living symbol of the alliance between the two men. And so Judah chose a wife. Not a woman from the line of Abraham, who understood the stories of Genesis and the promise of a Redeemer. Not one who worshipped the same invisible God. He married the daughter of Shua, a Canaanite. In the eyes of the world, it was a strategic move, a brilliant merger of Judah's noble lineage and Shua's immense wealth. But in the eyes of the one who gave the promise, it was a fissure, a dangerous crack in the fortress wall built to protect the purity of the sacred line. His forefather Abraham, in his God-given wisdom, had once made his chief servant swear a solemn oath not to take a wife for Isaac from among the Canaanite women. This was not about racial prejudice. It was about a profound spiritual incompatibility. The Canaanite faith was a chaotic mix of fertility gods, brutal rituals, and a worldview entirely opposed to the holiness God required. Esau, Jacob's brother, had ignored this and brought bitterness of spirit to his parents. Now Judah, the chief heir of the promise, was repeating that same mistake. Judah's new home in Adullam reflected this compromise. Beside the traditional leather skins for milk and the sheepskin rugs of his nomadic heritage, there now appeared small clay figurines of the goddess Astarte and Egyptian scarab amulets. The morning prayers to Yahweh were now mingled with afternoon incantations to Baal. And in this divided house, in this silent conflict between two worlds, Judah's firstborn son was born. They named him Er was not born into the purity of a single faith. He breathed the air of compromise. He grew up amidst prayers, spoken in two languages, offered to two different deities. He saw his father, on one hand, tell him of the great promise, and on the other hand, live by the customs of the Canaanites to please his in-laws and business partners. The first fissure had appeared, and through that crack, a shadow, a confusion of identity and purpose began to creep into the soul of the next generation. Can a tree planted in hybrid soil, watered from two opposing springs, ever bear sweet fruit, or will it carry the bitter taste of compromise? The fate of the child of the fissure, would soon provide the fateful answer. Grew up as a little prince in the kingdom his father had built. He was surrounded by affluence, attended by servants, and taught that he was the heir to a great clan. He carried all the privileges of a firstborn son. He was the future, Judah's hope. But there is a dangerous truth that is often forgotten. Privilege, without responsibility, curdles into arrogance, and legacy, if not cherished with the heart, becomes an empty burden. Was the tragic embodiment of this truth. He grew up not with the humility of a shepherd, but with the insolence of a rich merchant's son. He rode the finest horses, wore the most expensive clothes, and looked down upon the poor laborers in the markets of Adullam. When Judah tried to teach him about the heritage of Abraham, about the sacred promise, listened with a detached air. To him, these were outdated fairy tales, less real than owning another herd of cattle or winning a horse race. The wickedness of as the Bible describes it with brief but devastating force, was not a matter of public crimes like murder or theft. It was more subtle and far more insidious. It was a rottenness from within the soul, a contempt for sacred things. When came of age, Judah, still holding on to some connection with tradition, decided to find a wife for his son. But instead of choosing another Canaanite girl, perhaps in a subconscious effort to balance his own compromise, he sought out a family from the line of Shem. He chose Tamar, a beautiful name, meaning palm tree, a symbol of righteousness, vibrant life, and beauty in the midst of a dry desert. Tamar was a righteous woman, one who understood and treasured the promises of God. She came into the marriage with a pure heart, hoping to become a part of the sacred lineage. But to Tamar was not a life partner with whom to build a legacy. She was just another acquisition in his collection, a beautiful trophy to adorn his status, a means to produce his own heirs. Their wedding was a portrait of heartbreaking contrast. In his fine wedding attire, was dismissive and arrogant, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd for his wealthy friends. Tamar, though dignified in her bridal garments, could not hide a deep sorrow in her eyes. She had already sensed the coldness and emptiness in the soul of the man to whom she was binding her life. Their married life confirmed her worst fears. Had taken a righteous woman, but he used his own wickedness to eclipse her. He treated her as a possession, not a companion. And worst of all, he denied her the most precious gift within a marriage covenant, a child. Jewish commentators suggest that out of selfish vanity, deliberately prevented Tamar from conceiving so that her beauty would not be marred by pregnancy. Whatever the reason, his action was a blatant betrayal of the core purpose of marriage and of the promise of the lineage itself. He had turned a sacred union into a barren land, a desolate garden. He had dammed the flow of the thread of destiny at his own link in the chain. And then the inevitable happened. The judgment did not come from the sword of an enemy or from a wasting disease. It came silently. In the prime of his youth and arrogance, suddenly collapsed. No last words, no chance for repentance. God took him. A terrifying silence fell where a proud heart had once beaten. Judah's legacy now had a gaping hole. The thread of destiny, which was supposed to pass naturally through was now abruptly and violently severed. The entire clan was plunged into mourning and confusion, but amid the grief, a more frightening question hung in the air. When the first link, the most important link, is broken, how can the chain possibly continue? Who would step forward to mend this threatened future? In the fog of grief and confusion that enveloped Judah's household, there remained a glimmer of hope, a path laid out by tradition. It was not a new invention, but an ancient custom, a societal safety net designed by the wisdom of generations past to protect family lines from extinction. It was the law of Levirate, the brother-in-law marriage, a law rooted in community and sacrifice. When a man died without leaving a son to carry on his name, his next youngest brother had a sacred duty to marry the widow. The first son born of this union would not be considered the child of the biological father, but would carry the name and inherit the full legacy of the deceased brother. This was more than just a social rule about property. It was an act of loyalty, a sacrifice for the good of the entire clan, a way to ensure a man's name and lineage were not erased from the earth. It was how the thread of destiny, though severed, could be spliced back together. Now, that burden and that honor fell upon the shoulders of Onan, Judah's second son. He was the only hope for mending the wound and continuing the promise. Judah, his heart still heavy with the loss of one son, summoned Onan. His face was etched with the lines of sorrow, but there was an urgency in his voice, the voice of a patriarch trying to save his future. "Go to your brother's wife," he commanded. "Perform your duty as a brother-in-law, and raise up an heir for your brother." Onan stood there, bowing his head in apparent obedience. But behind his eyes, a cold and cruel calculus was taking place. Onan knew the law perfectly, but he also knew the laws of inheritance. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of his older brother, Now was gone, and by natural succession, Onan stood to become Judah's primary heir. The Levirate law, however, presented a complication. If he had a son with Tamar, that child would be heir. That child would take the very position Onan had just acquired. He would once again be relegated to a secondary status, working hard only to see the wealth pass to his brother's son. In Onan's mind, the question was not, "What is my duty?" but "What's in it for me?" And the answer was, nothing. Greed triumphed over loyalty. Selfishness strangled brotherly love. Onan obeyed his father's command. He married Tamar. In public he was the dutiful younger brother, the responsible husband. But in the privacy of the marriage bed, a despicable deception unfolded. He followed the letter of the law, but he desecrated its spirit. He went to Tamar, but he deliberately prevented conception, refusing to allow the seed of life a chance to take root. He turned a sacred act of life preservation into a selfish and empty gesture, a mockery of the covenant. For Tamar, this was a form of spiritual torture. She had hoped for a new beginning, a chance to fulfill her destiny. But instead, she was trapped in a sham marriage, treated as nothing more than a vessel. Each time, her hopes were dashed by Onan's cruel calculation. He showed contempt for his dead brother, for his widowed sister-in-law, and for the very God who had instituted the law to protect women like her. This act, committed in secret, could not be hidden from the one who sees every heart. Onan's wickedness was, in some ways, even worse than Er's. Was wicked with arrogance. Onan was wicked with cunning, cloaking himself in a robe of obedience. And so, judgment fell once more. Again, death came suddenly and without warning. In the midst of his daily life, Onan collapsed, just like his brother. And again, the silence of death descended upon the house of Judah. Onan's death was a terrible echo of Er's. It confirmed a frightening truth. The problem was not with Tamar, the righteous woman. The problem was with the sons of Judah. Rebellion and selfishness had become a hereditary disease, a curse that was destroying the lineage from within. The house of Judah, meant to be the cradle of kings, was now becoming a graveyard of heirs. The thread of destiny was not just broken, it was being systematically shredded by the very hands meant to protect it. Fear, a superstitious and panicked fear, now began to encircle and suffocate the mind of Judah. 2 sons, 2 sudden deaths without a single word of explanation, 2 freshly dug graves on the wind-swept hillside, standing like 2 giant question marks before the future of an entire clan. For Judah, this was no longer a coincidence or a tragedy. In his panicked mind, it had become a curse. A dark shadow seemed to be hanging over his family, an invisible force that was stealing his heirs one by one. And in his superstition, born of terror, his mind found a target for its blame. That dark shadow, to him, now wore the face of Tamar. He looked at his daughter-in-law as she sat quietly in her mourning clothes. But his gaze no longer held the compassion of a father-in-law for a young widow twice bereaved. It was the gaze of suspicion, of fear. He no longer saw her as a victim of circumstance, but as the cause of it. Perhaps she carried a bad omen. Perhaps the gods of her family were angry. Perhaps she herself was a living curse. Logic and faith had been completely paralyzed by horror. His gaze shifted to Shelah, his youngest son, his last golden hope. Shelah was just a boy, still in his teens, innocent of the tragedies engulfing his family. According to law and tradition, Shelah was next in line. When he was old enough, He would have to marry Tamar to raise up an heir for his brothers. It was the only way for the thread of destiny to continue. Judah knew this, but he did not dare. The image of his 2 dead sons haunted him in his sleep. The fear of losing his last son had become a monster that devoured all reason, all sense of duty, and all his faith in the promise of the Most High God. He was in an impossible position. He could not publicly refuse the Levirate law, as that would bring him great dishonor. But he could not bring himself to hand Sheila over to the woman he now believed was a killer of husbands. So, instead of seeking answers from God, instead of praying and repenting to understand the true cause of the calamity, he devised his own solution, a human solution, a solution built on a foundation of deception and delay. He summoned Tamar. He forced himself to put on a mask of kindness and sympathy. His voice was gentle, but his words were a velvet-gloved blade, pushing her out of his life smoothly but ruthlessly. "My daughter," he said, "return to your father's house and remain a widow there until my son Shelah grows up. Then I will call for you." On the surface, it sounded like a reasonable promise, an assurance that duty would be done at the proper time. It gave Tamar a ray of hope to cling to. But the Bible, with its sharp insight, exposes the true thought behind the sweet words. For he thought, lest he also die like his brothers. His promise was a sham, a lie designed for indefinite postponement, to get Tamar out of his sight. Judah built a fortress of fear around his last son. He smothered Shelah with care, insulated him from all risk, and above all kept him far away from Tamar. And to do this, he sacrificed her. He turned her from a daughter-in-law, a member of the clan, into an outcast, a living reminder of the tragedy he wanted to forget. He buried his responsibility under a promise he never intended to keep. Tamar, in her innocence and her respect for her father-in-law, believed him. She took off the garments of a wife to once again don the mourning clothes of a widow, and quietly left the family that had caused her so much pain to return to her childhood home. The door of Judah's house closed behind her, as heavy and final as a prison gate. The man entrusted with protecting the sacred lineage was now the one systematically sabotaging it. He had chosen the false safety of human schemes over faith in God's sovereignty. He thought he was protecting Shelah, but in reality he was severing the final link to the future that the promise had foretold. The thread of destiny was not just broken now, it was abandoned in a dark corner, forgotten by its own guardian. But destiny has a strange habit. Sometimes, from the most forgotten places, from the most wronged people, a glimmer of hope is ignited, not by permission, but by an act of daring faith. Time is a relentless current. It can heal wounds, but it can also erode even the hardest rock of hope. In her father's house, Tamar waited. The months turned into years. With every passing full moon, she would look toward the horizon, in the direction of Adullam, hoping to see the figure of a messenger from Judah's house. Every time a caravan passed, her heart would leap, anticipating a message, a summons. But all she received was silence. She lived like a ghost in her own home, a widow with no future, a branch that could bear no fruit. She heard, through the gossip of travelers, that Shelah had grown from a boy into a young man. She heard that he had come of age, that he was old enough to manage his own flocks and take part in the affairs of the clan. He was ready for marriage. But the door to her house remained quiet. Judah's promise now revealed its true nature. A hollow echo in the desert, a lie used to soothe a guilty conscience and buy time. The long wait transformed her grief into a painful clarity. She was no longer a naive girl who believed in empty promises. She saw through her father-in-law's fear and selfishness. But along with this personal disillusionment, a greater, more profound realization dawned on her. She understood that this story was not just about her wasted life. It was not just about the injustice she had suffered. It was about something far greater. It was about the future of a people. The thread of destiny, the promise of kings and of a Redeemer, was being left to rot because of the fear and faithlessness of one man. She had waited for the men of this lineage to act. Had failed through arrogant wickedness. Onan had failed through cunning selfishness. Judah had failed through superstitious fear. Now, there was no one left. Shelah, sheltered in his father's fortress of fear, would likely neither dare nor be permitted to act. If she did nothing, the promise could very well dissolve into nothing. The sacred lineage would end here, in a dead end of failure. In the heart of a woman viewed by society as weak, powerless, and even cursed, a bold decision, an unthinkable plan, began to form. It was not motivated by revenge. If she had wanted revenge, she could have publicly shamed Judah for his broken promise. But her goal was higher. It was a plan to restore justice, not just for herself, but for the covenant itself. A plan to seize the thread of destiny that was slipping away. She rose from the loom where she had woven the fabrics of her loneliness for so many years. The look in her eyes was no longer that of a passive victim, but that of a warrior who had found her cause. She knew that to confront a patriarchal system where a woman's word had no weight, she could not use conventional methods. She had to step outside the very rules that had bound and betrayed her. She had to use the system's own weaknesses against it. She had to make a gamble of faith, an act so risky that, if it failed, it would not only bring her contempt but could cost her her very life in the most horrific way. But for Tamar, a life without the promise, a life stripped of its destiny, was more terrifying than death itself. She was about to write one of the most controversial, yet inspiring, chapters in the history of faith. A lone woman, stripped of everything, was about to set a trap not to harm, but to save a sacred promise. She was about to confront a patriarch, not to bring him down, but to force him to face his own truth and his own responsibility. She was about to demand justice, not just for herself, but for God himself. The gamble had been decided. Now, all she needed was the right moment. The opportunity did not come in the form of a messenger or a decree, but in the form of a festival. The sheep-shearing festival at Timnah. In nomadic culture, this was more than just an agricultural task. It was a major event, marking the end of a season of hard work and the beginning of new income. It was a time of celebration, of feasting, of flowing wine and echoing laughter. A time when even the most austere men might let down their guard and indulge in earthly pleasures. Tamar heard, through the Women's Information Network, that Judah, now a widower himself, would be personally traveling to Timnah to oversee his shearing. A man in a state of emptiness, looking for comfort, and at his most vulnerable. This was the moment. Her plan was ready. Every detail was calculated with care and audacity. Her first action was deeply symbolic. She took off the mourning garments of a widow, the clothes that had defined her for so many years. She washed herself, put on different clothes, and most importantly, she covered her face with a thick veil. The veil did more than hide her face from recognition. It was a transformative tool. It temporarily erased the identity of Tamar, the abandoned widow, and cloaked her in a dangerous role, that of a cult prostitute, a figure familiar in Canaanite culture, but foreign to her own traditions. She did not choose a hidden spot. She chose a strategic one, a place impossible to miss. At the entrance to Enaim, a town on the main road to Timnah, anyone traveling to the festival would have to pass this way. She sat there, silent and mysterious, a veiled figure waiting for her quarry. And then Judah appeared. He was traveling with his friends and servants, perhaps having already had some wine, his mood buoyed by the festive atmosphere. As he passed the entrance to Enaim, his eyes caught the veiled woman sitting by the roadside. In the haze of the festival and the loneliness following his wife's death, he did not recognize his daughter-in-law. He did not see Tamar. He saw only an opportunity to satisfy a fleeting desire, a distraction from the burdens and tragedies of his life. He broke away from his companions and approached her. The conversation was quick and direct, like a business transaction. "Let me come in to you," he proposed. Tamar, with an incredible calmness hidden behind the veil, began her play. Her voice was altered so as not to be recognized. "What will you give me to come in to me?" "I will send you a young goat from my flock," Judah answered hastily. A promise. Another promise from Judah. But Tamar had learned a bitter lesson about his promises. This time she would not leave empty-handed. She needed a guarantee, an undeniable pledge, irrefutable proof. "Then give me a pledge until you send it," she said, her tone firm. Judah, his reason clouded by desire, asked impatiently, "What pledge shall I give you?" And here was the masterstroke of her entire plan. Tamar's demand was not for money or jewels, things that could be easily replaced. She demanded the irreplaceable, items that carried Judah's very soul and identity. Your seal, your cord, and the staff in your hand. The seal, used to impress his mark on important documents, was as good as his signature. The cord, often intricately made, was used to wear the seal around his neck, and the staff, more than a walking stick, was a symbol of authority, carved with the unique markings of a clan chief. To give these three items away was to give away his very identity. Judah, suspecting nothing, removed them and handed them to the mysterious woman. The deal was done. After it was over, Tamar quietly rose, blended into the crowd, and disappeared. She returned home, shed her disguise, and once again put on her widow's clothes, along with the three fateful objects. The gamble had been made, the seed had been sown. Now she could only wait and trust that justice, though it had to travel a winding and dangerous road, would finally speak. 3 months. 90 long days of silence and suspense. For Judah, it was a period in which he had returned to his daily life, the brief encounter by the roadside likely forgotten. He had sent his friend with the goat as promised, but the mysterious woman had vanished without a trace. To him, it was merely a failed transaction, a small secret to be buried by time. But for Tamar, it was 3 months of breathless anticipation. Her body began to change, and a new life, undeniable proof, was growing within her. And then, the secret could no longer be contained. The news began to leak out, first in whispers, then spreading like a desert wildfire. Finally, it reached Judah. A member of the clan came running, his face a mask of indignation and judgment. "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, the one living as a widow in her father's house, has played the harlot. And look, the proof is plain. She is with child." Imagine the shock and fury that seized Judah. In his eyes, this was an unforgivable disgrace. The honor of his family, his own honor, had been trampled in the dust. He did not pause for a second to reflect on his own broken promise, on the fact that he himself had pushed Tamar into this desperate corner. No, his mind was filled only with the image of a woman who had broken the law, who had defiled the lineage. The hypocrisy is staggering. The man who had broken his vow, who had sinned with his own daughter-in-law in a secret encounter, now appointed himself the supreme judge. He needed no trial. He needed no witnesses. In his blind rage, he pronounced the sentence immediately. His voice thundered through the camp. "Bring her out and let her be burned." To be burned alive, one of the most brutal and shameful punishments, reserved for the gravest sins of spiritual impurity. The sentence was delivered, reflecting the depth of Judah's anger and self-righteousness. The law was invoked. Strong men were dispatched. They went to Tamar's father's house and dragged her out. The scene was chaotic. The people of the camp gathered in a circle, their faces a mixture of curiosity, condemnation, and morbid excitement. She was facing a horrific death, a death ordered by her own father-in-law. Judah stood there, at the center of it all, playing the part of the just executioner, the protector of the clan's purity. This was the moment her gamble could have failed catastrophically. One wrong word, one misstep, and everything would end in flames. But Tamar did not panic. She had prepared for this moment. As she was being led out, she did not scream out her defense. She did not weep and beg for mercy. She maintained a dignified silence. She let the truth speak for itself. She called a trusted servant and handed him a small cloth bundle. "Take this to the chief," she said clearly, "and tell him this. I am with child by the man who owns these things. Please, examine them and see whose seal and cord and staff these are." The servant pushed through the crowd and brought the bundle to Judah. He snatched it violently, perhaps thinking it was a final, pathetic plea. But when he opened it, his face changed. The fury vanished as if blown away by a harsh wind, replaced by a look of stunned recognition that froze him to the spot. Lying in his palm were his own seal, his own cord, and his own staff. The irrefutable evidence. A hush fell over the entire assembly. All eyes now shifted from Tamar to Judah. The undeniable proof lay in his hands. The cloak of his self-righteousness was ripped away without mercy. He was cornered, not by an army, but by the truth and the courage of the woman he had cast aside. And in that deafening silence, something miraculous happened. Judah's pride shattered. Instead of denial, instead of rage, a profound brokenness occurred within him. He looked at Tamar, and for the first time in years, he truly saw her. He saw her cornered righteousness, her loyalty to the covenant, and his own humiliating failure. He lifted his head and faced the entire assembly. His voice was no longer a roar, but trembled with the weight of exposed truth. "She is more righteous than I," he confessed, "because I did not give her to my son Shelah." A thunderclap. Not a thunderclap of punishment from the heavens, but a thunderclap of justice restored on earth. With a single sentence, Judah saved Tamar's life, publicly admitted his own sin, and unwittingly cleared the path for the thread of destiny to continue. The crisis was over, justice was served. But one final surprise, the signature of the Most High, was yet to come. Judah's public confession acted like an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the deceit and fear he had built. All the whispers and condemnations ceased instantly. Tamar, in a breathtaking reversal, was transformed from a condemned sinner into a vindicated and honored woman. She was welcomed back into the clan of Judah, not as a spurned widow bearing a curse, but as the respected mother of the next generation, the one who had used her wisdom and courage to preserve the future of the entire lineage. The thread of destiny, which had seemed as thin as a wisp of smoke and had been left to disintegrate, was now firmly secured by an act no one could have foreseen. But the story was not over. It seems the Most High, after allowing humanity to walk a dramatic path of sin, failure, and repentance, wanted to place a final divine signature on this chapter. A prophetic mark, a message encoded in the very event of the birth itself, to affirm that his hand was always in control, even in the smallest details. And the birth of Tamar's children was just such a living message. When her time came to give birth, another surprise awaited. She was not carrying one child, but two, twins, a sign of blessing and abundant fertility. The tent grew tense with anticipation. The midwife, an experienced woman, was by her side to assist. As Tamar's labor reached its peak, a strange thing happened, a rare occurrence in childbirth. One of the babies pushed a hand out first. The midwife, following custom and law to accurately identify the firstborn, acted immediately. She took a bright scarlet thread, a color that was vivid and easy to see, and quickly tied it around the wrist of the protruding hand. She announced with certainty for all in the tent to hear, "This one came out first." The scarlet thread, a mark of preeminence, a human recognition of the natural order. This was the firstborn, the heir who would receive the double portion of the inheritance, the one who would assume leadership. Everything seemed to be settled, clearly and logically. But then, an event that defied all logic occurred. The baby with the scarlet thread, instead of continuing its exit, suddenly pulled its hand back inside. Instantly, almost in the same moment, its twin brother seized the opportunity, surged forward and was born first. An unbelievable reversal, a stunning breakthrough. The unmarked child, the second child, had claimed the right of the firstborn with a decisive act. The midwife, in her astonishment, exclaimed the question that would become the child's name. "How did you make such a breakthrough, Perez, for yourself?" And so, they named the baby Perez, which means breakthrough or breach. Only after Perez was safely born did his brother, the one with the scarlet thread still tied to his wrist, finally emerge. They named him Zerah, which means dawn or brightness, perhaps in memory of his brief initial appearance, a brightness that was eclipsed by a sudden breakthrough. This dramatic event in the birthing tent was not a random accident of nature. It was a living prophecy, a miniature play depicting how God works in the history of salvation. It was a declaration that his plan is not bound by human rules, signs, or expectations. He frequently chooses the second instead of the first, the overlooked instead of the preferred. He chose Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, and later he would choose David, the youngest shepherd boy, over his tall, impressive older brothers. And now he had chosen Perez, the child conceived in scandal, the result of a risky gamble and a late confession, was the one chosen to carry the thread of destiny. His breakthrough at birth was a perfect microcosm of how God would act through his lineage, breaking through old orders and human failures to bring about a new salvation, a new kingdom, a new beginning from the ashes of failure. Time continued its relentless march, a river carrying away both joy and sorrow. The main characters in our turbulent drama gradually faded into the past, making way for new generations. Became a faint name in the genealogy, a tragic warning about wasted privilege and a disobedient heart. Onan became a timeless lesson in selfishness and the consequences of scorning the divine plan. Judah, after his life-altering confession, went on to live and lead his tribe. But perhaps he did so with a humility and wisdom forged in the fire of failure and repentance. He had learned that God's faithfulness was infinitely greater than man's faithlessness. But Perez, the child of the breakthrough, the one who breached his way into the world, grew up. He did not carry the arrogance of or the calculation of Onan. He carried a destiny. He grew, married, and had children of his own. And through him, the thread of destiny, which had seemed so utterly shattered by sin and fear, was woven anew, stronger and more vibrant than ever before, like a tapestry woven with threads of grace upon a background of human weakness. The history of salvation is a long, unfolding scroll, and if we unroll it, we find the name of Perez as an indispensable link. A series of images flashes by, generation after generation. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. The line continued, patient and persistent, through Aminadab, and then Nahshon, a leader during the time of the Exodus from Egypt. And Nahshon fathered Salmon. The pattern of miraculous grace continued. This lineage seemed to have a special attraction to foreign women of extraordinary faith. Salmon married another Canaanite woman, Rahab, the very prostitute from Jericho who had, by faith, saved the spies and her entire family. This union of a prince of Judah and a woman once rejected by society produced a man named Boaz. Boaz, a man of great integrity and wealth, known as a kinsman redeemer, continued the family tradition by marrying another foreign widow, Ruth the Moabitess, in another timeless story of loyalty, love, and improbable redemption. And they fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. The shepherd boy, overlooked by his brothers and forgotten by his own father, but the one whom God anointed to be the greatest king in Israel's history, a man after God's own heart. Centuries later, when we open the first pages of the New Testament in the Gospel of Matthew, we find a genealogy, a roadmap leading to the pinnacle of human history. And right there, in the third verse, an astonishing detail is recorded, confirming the importance of the story we have just explored. And Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. In a long list of patriarchs, leaders, and kings, the name of Tamar is mentioned with honor, the name of the woman who made a desperate gamble, the name of the one who was socially outcast, accused, and nearly burned alive, yet who is celebrated by Scripture itself as an ancestress of the Messiah. Why? Because her audacious act, driven by a profound faith in the covenant, preserved the lineage of the Redeemer at its most fragile and vulnerable moment. The story began with Judah's compromise, continued with the sin of his sons and his own fear, but it was saved by the faith of Tamar and concluded in the grace of God. The true crimson thread, the thread of redemption, was not the one hastily tied on Zerah's wrist, a symbol of human expectation. The true, deep crimson thread was this very thread of destiny, a thread that passed through human chaos and scandal, stained by failure, tears, and sacrifice, yet never broke, because it was held in the faithful and sovereign hands of God. The story of Judah and Tamar reminds us of an eternal and comforting truth. God's plan is not built on our perfection, but on His faithfulness. He can take our worst mistakes, our deepest shames, and weave them into His great and glorious story. So, look at your own life. What failures, what shames, what wrong turns do you think have defined you and closed every door to the future? Remember Tamar, remember Perez. For even in the most chaotic and painful breakthroughs of life, it may be that the grace of God is at its most powerful and mysterious work, weaving a new chapter for your story.